So what I've done for us tonight is I have dug into our archives and I have pulled out material that we have relating to Dartmouth and the civil rights movement from the 60s. I primarily tried to limit it to the 60s. The caveat that I should issue, the warning I should issue right from the start is this is by no means a comprehensive drawing out of all the things that we have. So what you're seeing is a small sampling or representative sampling of the sorts of things that I discovered. And I'm going to talk about the things that I thought were interesting or important because I get to do that because I'm leading the group. But having said that, some of you obviously will probably at Dartmouth during this time. Hi, welcome, come on in, it's okay. You may have lived through these events, so I apologize if I don't hit your the top 5 for you. But please, by all means, feel free to interject if you have some information to add, or if I get something wrong, please feel free to correct me. I will not take that personally. I would just ask be brief because we've got a lot of stuff to get through. Okay. So what I wanted to do tonight is talk. I'm going to talk about 5 different groups or individuals associated with civil rights at Dartmouth, and then after I talk about each group, I'm going to talk a little bit about the things on the table that are related to that event or that group. Okay. I'm hoping not to talk for more than, this is like, I usually don't talk, but what usually happens is students come in here and I just sort of get out of the way and let the students interact with the materials. This is a little different tonight because it's a different kind of program. But what I will do is talk as briefly as possible and hopefully give you guys some time at the end of the hour, maybe about 15 or 20 minutes, to just go around the whole table and look at stuff, turn pages, pick up photos, that kind of thing, because we are nothing if not interactive here at Dartmouth. Are there any questions before we get started? All right. I have a little script prepared. I apologize for that. Usually I'm pretty off the cuff, but there's a lot of acronyms and people's names and that kind of thing, and so I want to make sure I get it right. So I'm going to read a little bit from this, and I apologize if that comes off as a little wooden. So Dartmouth College is an institution that typically comes to mind when thinking of the African-American civil rights movement in the U.S. For one, the college's geographic remoteness from the hot spots of controversy during the 1960s, such as Selma, Alabama, suggests a similar ideological and intellectual detachment from the problems of African Americans in the Deep South during this period. In spite of this assumption, many students at Dartmouth felt passionately about the issue of equality and actively participated in the struggle for social justice that came to a head in the 1960s. So what I'm going to talk about, first about the ABC program, Better Chance program, which you probably are all familiar with, or at least some of you. I'm then going to talk about important speakers who came to Dartmouth during the 60s who were related to or connected somehow to the civil rights movement. I'm going to talk about George Cobfleisch and the Dartmouth Christian Union on campus, as well as some student activism that occurred off of Dartmouth's campus down in the South. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about African American students at Dartmouth and the AfroAmerican Society. Okay. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the ABC movement. So the students weren't the only people who felt like they should get involved, and in fact, John Sloan Dickey, the president of Dartmouth in the 60s, up until I think 68, he actually was trying to find ways to get Dartmouth involved with countering or combating the educational inequality that existed for African Americans and other disadvantaged kids in the South and in other areas. So in 1963, he asked Charles Dye, who was class of 52, to head up a cooperative venture with a group of prep schools in the area. One of the problems that Dartmouth was having, and a lot of colleges, they would be asked, well, why don't we have more African American students in our colleges? And the answer was always, well, we don't have any apply. No African American students ever apply. And so Dickey thought that partnering with this prep school group would create sort of to students, African American students, feeling confident and also being prepared to come to college and attend college. So what they did, they partnered with these prep schools, and the schools had founded a program called the Independent Schools Talent Search Program, ISTSP. Which in itself partnered with the National Scholarship Service and Fund for Negro Students, NSS and FNS, and there will be a test on this later. So. The idea was that the NSS FNS would recruit students to apply for the ISTSP which would then guarantee them admission and full financial aid to a partnering prep school, provided that the students completed a summer transition program at Dartmouth. So these are middle school students who, if they can get through a summer transition program at Dartmouth, sort of helping them with like get up to speed in terms of what would be expected at prep schools, then they would be guaranteed full financial aid and also admission. And that was started in '63. And in his oral history that he did with us, Doc Dye says he thinks he was asked to head the program because he had actually taught at Andover, or Phillips Academy in Andover, which is a pretty prestigious prep school at the time, and still is. I also kind of wonder if he wasn't asked because he and his older brother Bill, they were the first in their family to go to college. So I can't help wonder if, at least on an educational aspect, they sort of understood what it was like to not come up through the system. It's a very, very manicured, curated educational program. Because there were more than just African American kids in the ABC program. There were also some white kids, that kind of thing. So Doc Dye said he envisioned the summer program as being Andover in the summer, with coats and ties, sit-down dinners, and a dorm where Dartmouth students cohabitated and acted as resident tutors for the kids participating in the program. For Dye, the real backbone of the program is getting to the participants getting to interact with college students and getting to feel comfortable around them and engage with them. So he and John Sloan Dickey came up with the name A Better Chance, or ABC, and the first class of 55 students arrived at Dartmouth in 1964 for 8 weeks of extensive preparation. At the end of the summer, the faculty and Dye, they evaluated the students and recommended about 40 of the 55 without reservation. And then the other 15, they sort of had reservations. But it turned out that pretty much all of them were accepted anyway, even the ones who were still pretty much at risk, which is good. As the partnership with the prep schools progressed, however, they found that this recruiting, the prep schools were in connection with this scholarship, sort of this recruiting organization, the NSSFNS, or NFS, and they found that they were really recruiting more for, they were trying to recruit just for college, so they weren't really thinking about the prep schools or the high school experience. They were just trying to get African American students, put them right into college. So the prep school group split with the recruiting group, and then asked if they could come hang out and join Dartmouth basically, and have their home here at Dartmouth. And so they were okay with that. Dartmouth said yes, of course. And so then Doc Dye became the director of that. He became responsible then for determining, okay, sending out the folders or the files on these students and saying, okay, to all the prep schools saying, you're going to accept them, right? Here are some students, now that they've passed the summer. He kept finding, though, that some of these schools would just keep sending the folders back and saying, oh, send us someone else, send us someone else. We don't like this one, we don't like that one. And even had one headmaster of a very wealthy prep school drive up in his chauffeured Cadillac and they'd just say, well, we're just a poor country school, and we can't afford to take students. And he started wheeling and dealing with this guy, and he realized that what they really wanted, he wanted some athletes. They wanted some African American kids who were athletically exceptional, so that they could dominate the prep school sports, right? And so Doc was like, well, we don't recruit for that, so no. So but it's just sort of a slice, sort of a window into the minds of some of these schools and their real rationales. So what Doc had to do finally was he published an open letter to all the prep schools that listed the names of the prep schools and the students that they had accepted, and completely shamed most of these prep schools, because some of them were taking lots of students, but other ones hadn't taken a single student yet. And so he said after that, it started sped up pretty quickly once they realized they were going to be held publicly accountable. So eventually, the program became such a success that Dartmouth's Office for Economic Opportunity asked Doc Dye to find a way to take in 1,000 students instead of just 55. And all the prep schools just completely balked at that. They said, we can't absorb that cost for full financial aid and tuition. And so what Doc decided to do was he said, well, let's switch it over to public schools. And let's start an ABC program with public schools. And what he envisioned was having a residential house in the town, same time as the public school, and having all the students participating in the program living in that house and then attending school at the local public school. And so he started one here in Hanover, and actually the first group lived in the Wheelock House, which is now Roberts Flowers, and attended Hanover High, which, as you can imagine, was a big sort of, there was a big hubbub and fuss about this in the town meeting, but then they were all, yeah, sure, we're on board. Because he basically said, if you're going to fund international students to come over here and go here, why won't you fund these African American students to come do the same thing? And they were like, yeah, okay, that makes sense. So he hired, he lured, I guess I should say, Tom McCullough away from Phillips Academy in Andover to come up and be the first resident director to live in the house with the students and sort of be like the dorm dad or whatever you want to call it. And he also got Bill McCurran Jr., who's the class of '69, to be one of the first resident tutors. And Bill was an African American, so when the program originally started, there weren't enough African Americans at Dartmouth that he couldn't have staffed the tutor positions with African Americans if he'd wanted to. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later, how the numbers then after that began to decline in terms of African American student attendance. So eventually, Tom McCullough, who was the first resident director here at the ABC House in Hanover, he took over the program, the ABC program, from Doc, who was asked to become the dean of Tucker Foundation. So Tom, after that, took over. He founded 36 different ABC houses from here all the way to California, and so it became a really big success under his tutelage. Dye's oral history, and I actually have a copy of the oral history here. It's fascinating. It's filled with some really compelling stories, and there's one that I wanted to read. It's an excerpt from his history about when the program first started. He and his wife got a Vaux car, which is like one of the Dartmouth rental cars, basically, and they drove down to the south to pick up some of these students who were going to participate in the program for the first time. And I wanted to read, if you'll indulge me, I want to read a little bit, an excerpt from this, because every time I read this, I tear up, and I will try not to tear up when I read this to you. But this is just gives you an idea of the wonderful stories and really moving testimonials from the oral histories. We have tons of oral histories here at Dartmouth. You guys can come in and look at any time. So anyway, this is Doc Dye. My wife and I took a college car with Vox Clematis in Deserto on the license plate, and we visited families in Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama. Because the recruiter, Jim Simmons, had come from North Carolina, most of our kids came from east of the Mississippi. We spent a few days in Alabama and Birmingham, visiting schools and the Baptist church where the kids had been killed. We could feel the hostility then, whites driving with blacks and all that sort of thing. 4 of our students from Birmingham drove with us back to Hanover in the college car. I remember we stayed at a Holiday Inn on the way down, and we were reassured by their sign. We welcome all comers, and that was in Virginia. So on the way back, we left early in the morning and drove an extra long time to get to a Holiday Inn in Athens, Georgia for lunch. We pulled the tables together so that 6 of us could sit and order from the menu. The next thing I know, the waitress was at my elbow and she had the manager of the place, and he said, "I'm sorry, we can't serve you." "Why not? We don't serve them." And so I said, "Well, we're not here to make trouble." And the manager said, "Now, if this civil rights legislation is passed, why, then we will, but it's not the law and we don't have to serve them. Would you like the name of the owners?" And I said, "Yes, I'd like the name of the owners." He wrote on a paper napkin the names of the owners of the Holiday Inn in Athens, Georgia. So Phoebe, his wife, escorted the kids out, and I'm still there. The place was packed. Everybody stopped eating. Just quiet throughout the whole place. So I pull the tables apart, and I'm resetting the places. I'm just going to make them suffer as long as possible, if there was any suffering. And then suddenly a voice from the next table, and this guy said, "What's the matter?" And I said, "They won't serve us." He said, "That's too bad." And that was nice. This part that gets me. I go out on the sidewalk, and one of the kids is crying. These are 14-year-olds, and the kid's crying. And he's saying, "Someday we're going to throw them out." And so I'm trying to think, how do I handle it? What do I say to the kid? That's not the lesson. That's not the object. I don't think I did that very well. The last thing we wanted to do with these 4 kids was give anybody trouble. Obviously, that was not the way to get them back to Hanover. So when we got to Charlotte, we had overnight reservations in Charlotte, North Carolina. I went in and I said, "Look, we've already had trouble today. We don't want any more. We have 4 black kids and they're students and they're in an academic program. But you have to tell me if we can't stay here." And he hesitated and he said, "We've never had any, but I guess it's about time." Something like that. And so they let us in. So that just gives you a kind of idea of what they were up against. later in his interview, Dye goes on to say, if this country was doing what it ought to be doing, there wouldn't be a need for the ABC program. So one of our objectives ought to be in the long run to see that we don't have a need for ABC programs. And he also said, this is my favorite quote, he also said, having taught at Andover, I was persuaded that the Andovers of the world probably needed those kids more than those kids needed Andover. So I've got some stuff here from the ABC program, and later you guys can have a chance to look through it. But I've got the entirety of Dr. Dye's oral history transcript of that, and that's available to look at anytime you guys want to. I have here a group photo. I think I'm not sure if it's McNutt or where the steps are. Maybe Dartmouth Hall. Of all the students from the summer of 1964, the first class, 55 students, all standing there. It has their names in the back too. Then I've got a brochure, which is pretty cool. A Better Chance from '66, talking all about the program. And then a couple of things, I'll walk these around so you guys can see. These are great. These are so here they are, the Andover in the summer, right? So here are the kids dressed up in their coats and ties. I can't imagine how hot it must have been. At least they were in New Hampshire, not in Florida. And I also have a photo here of the first ABC house in Hanover. So this is the old Wheelock residence. So you guys can see. I've got a few more pictures over there as well, so you guys can take a look at them later. There's also a pamphlet over there, Better Chance, by Tom Nicholas. Talking about the program that he started during the public school program. So that's the ABC program. Dartmouth was attempting in its own way to overcome the lack of admissions applications from African American students by getting involved with that program. And it also provided a way for the students on campus who were engaged with social justice issues to get involved, because they could then apply to be tutors and help out every summer. Another way in which they were able to engage with the movement, at least in thought, if not in deed, was by attending presentations on campus given by notable figures connected with the civil rights movement. The Great Issues course, which was a class that all seniors were required to take during that time, was responsible for bringing Martin Luther King Jr. to campus in the spring of 1962. He gave a talk right over in Dartmouth Hall. After receiving a standing ovation upon entering, he spoke to an audience that filled the room to capacity and spilled out into the hallway. In his talk, King called upon President Kennedy to issue an executive order, which he said would be akin to a second Emancipation Proclamation. And he also emphasized that there were nearly 5 million unregistered African American voters in the South, a fact that would not be lost on Dartmouth students in the year to come. So what I have there, unfortunately, one of the challenges that we have in the archives with the civil rights movement at Dartmouth is that a lot of the students who were organizers weren't thinking, they were really in the now, which obviously is what they should have been, but they weren't really thinking long term. So we don't have a lot of good documentation, especially, strangely enough, for Martin Luther King Jr.'s visit, and also later, as I'll talk about, for Malcolm X's visit, we don't have a lot of documentation. We have to rely on the D for the most part, which is the student newspaper at the time, for that kind of information. So what I've done here is I pulled the Dartmouth, the college newspaper from 1962, Friday, May 25th. It has a very small photo at the bottom of Dr. King speaking in Dartmouth Hall. So, at least he made the front page. Maybe below the fold.
Valley News didn't cover that.
They may have, I don't know, but the challenge, and this is not a knock on the Valley News, this is just the reality, they don't index their newspaper. So we have no way to search. We have no way to search to find out if they did or not. I'm sure they must have. So this is I have the newspaper here. This is great, and this is also fun to flip through because you can sort of get an idea about. I saw you pointing at the The dual filter, the ads, especially during this time, were just fascinating. You get a kind of sense of the culture at the time. And then the headline, of course, above Dr. King, Carpenter circles Earth 3 times, retro rocket failure causes overshoot. All right, so you can sort of get a sense of what was on the national consciousness at that time. I also put here, riffing on the second emancipation comment by Dr. King, I also have, this is actually a commencement address given by the Reverend James H. Robinson, and it's called The Second Emancipation, and it was delivered, I think I just said at commencement. And then we also have a letter from Dr. King, actually from February 1960. He had initially been asked to come here earlier than that, but was unable to because of the events that were going on in the South, and because he needed to be there. So I think that's our only piece of paper with his signature on it. Another guest, who I already alluded to, Malcolm X, came to speak on campus 3 years later in January of 1965. Dartmouth was the last Ivy League school to host the chairman for the Organization for Afro-American Unity. He was invited to campus as the second speaker in the Undergraduate Council lecture series. And 2 students in particular were instrumental in making his visit possible. One was Ahmed Osman, class of 65, who was Muslim, and he actually went and heard Malcolm X speak in New York, and then afterwards started talking with him about sort of the specifics of his faith, of their shared faith, because that was right after Malcolm X had broken, I think, with the Nation of Islam. So he and Richard Joseph, who was also the class of 65, got Malcolm X to come up here and give a talk in January of 65, just a month before he was assassinated. And so here again, we have to rely on the Dartmouth for news about that, for images of that. But we have again, below this thing. For some reason, they don't print newspaper, really quality paper. So once again, we have a very small photo down here of Malcolm X with his friend, with is it Ahmed? Yeah, Ahmed Osman. Yeah. So. WDCR, which was the Dartmouth radio station, did an interview with Malcolm X, and we actually have a transcript of that, and it's really fascinating to read through the entire thing. There are a lot of he makes some really scary parallels. I mean, as I was preparing for this, I was reading in the news about Ferguson, Missouri, and some of the things that Malcolm X says in there about the police and governmental authorities and their interactions with the African American community is just it's really eerie because it seems like nothing has changed. So that's the thing. Those are the very few materials we have on Malcolm X. In the Dartmouth in the D on January 28th, 1965, after Malcolm X had visited. Richard Joseph, who was one of the people responsible for bringing the students responsible for bringing him to campus, he actually wrote an editorial to the Dartmouth, which is right here, and he delineated the various nuanced approaches taken by various civil rights groups within the movement, and I thought that was really important because he was being really careful to point out the fact this isn't just sort of like this one mass unified movement. Like, there are lots of different philosophies and groups with different approaches or different ideas about how these goals should be achieved. And that was why Martin Luther King, but also Malcolm X, to show these varying opinions. So students at Dartmouth were getting exposed to a level of subtlety with regard to the movement, which obviously is a good thing. At the end of his editorial, Richard Joseph says, "My ultimate aim is an American society of equal men." In the fall of 1963, which was after Martin Luther King Jr., but before Malcolm X, a third speaker associated with the civil rights movement came to campus whose philosophy could arguably be defined as the antithesis of Joseph's statement. George Wallace was the governor of Alabama and the poster child for segregation in the South during the 1960s. He was most notable for his attempt to block African American students' access to public schools, both politically and physically. And Wallace's appearance at Dartmouth was expressly meant as, quote, an opportunity for direct confrontation with the governor and his views, end quote, according to W. Slade Backer, class of '64, who was the president of the undergraduate council at the time. For some Dartmouth students, this confrontation meant more than just a battle of words. Approximately 200 picketers, comprised of students and faculty wearing black armbands, marched in protest outside Lebanon Fieldhouse, where Wallace spoke to a crowd of nearly 4,000 people. And afterwards, at least one witness to the event and the protest remarked that the picketing was, quote, pretty dignified and, quote, well behaved. So, we have some material from that. We have a transcript, actually, of his address. So, everything that he said, as well as the Q&A that occurred afterwards. We have some great photos. Here's one. You get a sense of the audience. I'm speaking in the field house.
Oh, that was the field house one.
Yeah, that's the field house. About 4,000 people crowded in to hear him.
Oh, and this is the one here.
And there wasn't a lot of disruption within the field house. I read one account said he was applauded like 27 times or something.
What year was this?
63.
Okay, in the 67.
So, and in contrast, there was a very small group, less than 5% of the population inside the building was outside the building, marching around, all with posters. And this is actually, this African American student here, this is actually Richard Joseph, who was one of 5 African American students in his class, a class of hundreds. Dr. Joseph is now a professor at Northwestern in history, African history. We're indebted to him today because just last week he lifted the restriction on his oral history so that people could have students could have access. So that was 63. A lot changed between 63 and 67, which is when George Wallace came back to campus. His visit to campus on May 3rd, 1967 would turn out to be anything but well behaved. What began with heckling and anti-Wallace chanting in the auditorium, actually it was right here in this building. It was here in Webster Hall. He spoke. This used to be a performance hall, and so he spoke from the stage, which is now the tower comes out from the stage quite a bit. But there was a stage back there, and that's where he spoke. Anti-Wallace chanting in the auditorium was started by 7 African American students, and it ended outside with a mob of about 500 students and other people, mostly white. Some of the people in this room confronting Wallace outside of Webster, but they didn't confront Wallace. Outside of Webster Hall after his talk. Wallace's car was seriously damaged by the crowd, whose actions were later described by the Hanover police chief as the worst behavior he'd seen in 22 years. And I actually have the paper, the headline there in the scrapbook.
But didn't they project his speech to those of us outside?
Yep, I'm going to get there in just a second.
Okay.
You're on it. So Wallace had planned to stay in Hanover overnight, but instead he changed his plans and he drove south to Concord to avoid any further confrontations. Although participants doubtless felt justified in their actions because of his history of active segregation, the college administration made it clear that such actions were inappropriate within an academic environment. The administration, notably Dean Seymour, first sent a telegram of apology to Governor Wallace and then suspended Dartmouth students who participated overtly in that disturbance. In a report released by the dean, what became known as the Wallace Incident was explained as being prefaced by a campus controversy between the Eastman Kodak Corporation and FIGHT, which was a Rochester, New York civil rights organization. And the company had refused to train and employ African American workers at its Rochester, New York factory. And so FIGHT was an organization that was keeping them accountable because they had actually signed an agreement saying, yes, we will employ African Americans, and then they reneged on that agreement. So Dartmouth students numerous groups on campus, such as the Dartmouth Christian Union, the AfroAmerican Society, and others, insisted that Dartmouth divest itself of its stock holdings in Easton Kodak because they were shareholders. And so there was this big controversy where the students were even staged a sit-in in front of President Dickey's office, like the week before Wallace came. And Dickey and the administration was saying, well, it's too early to make a decision, a hasty decision, we don't have all the facts, that kind of thing. So tensions were really high before Wallace even got there. And then he showed up with all his cameras, national news media, bright lights, loudspeakers, and that didn't help. Despite security precautions, a group of students led by a Colby Junior College professor rushed the stage at one point, causing a considerable disturbance before being stopped by students and ushers and escorted outside. And after that, things seemed to go pretty well in terms of disruption within the auditorium. And that probably would have been it, but for the fact that WDCR, again, the radio station, was broadcasting the speech. So all the students and everyone else who was listening in the area heard all this disturbance and this commotion going on in the hall, and so they all came out to see what was going on. Right at about the time that Wallace was escorted out the back to his car, and so everyone sort of pressed in, and there were a few people who were being deliberately disruptive and destructive, and he couldn't get the car to start. They had to move him to another car in the midst of this entire crowd. The hood got crunched in. The aerial was bent to smithereens. A few years ago, we actually had an exhibit on this. I think in 2012, and we had a class. I think I remember the class of I think it was 65. And he was like, "I was one of the guys in the hood." He was very proud of himself. But anyway. Yeah, so anyway, it made it really hard for Wallace to get out of there. So finally they got a car that started. And it was actually Dartmouth students who cleared the way and got Wallace out of there. And as as President Dickey put it, a few silly people got the trouble they apparently wanted. So the campus did a massive sort of PR blitz to try to sort of say, well, it's just a few malcontents. It doesn't represent the entire campus. And perhaps rightly so, they said this isn't the way that we should be behaving in an academic setting, right? There should be freedom of speech, there should be the opportunity to express one's opinions and have them heard without this kind of action being taken. What I have here from that event, I have more photographs, including some from Rauner, now Rauner, but then Webster Hall. At least some of the Dartmouth students unfurled a Confederate flag. Some of the African American students, it's kind of hard to see, but they have a little tiny sign that says Wallace is a racist. And then the crowd pressing in. And apparently, a police officer threatening an African American student. But not, doing anything about the white students. Then this is Dickey's handwritten, press release sort of saying, yeah, they got what they wanted. What's interesting here is a lot of these records have become open because it's been 50 years. So, this is 67, but So some of the 64 stuff is just out of the 64 is out of that. And this isn't closed, it's in a separate folder. Don't worry, I'm not showing you a closed stuff. But this is interesting. This is a note to President Dickey saying, Mr. Lane called from New York at 1 a.m. and talked with the night man. He said to tell you the alumni had pledged over $50,000 but had withdrawn over $27,000 of it because of the Wallace incident in Hanover Wednesday night. So there were real repercussions for that. This is a report. This is the actual Dean Seymour's report detailing everything that happened as he saw it or heard it. And then this is a copy of the official resolution laying out the punishment for the students who were involved. So, all right, so despite this inappropriate, if not undeserved, reaction to Wallace's speech, Dartmouth students did do more for the civil rights movement than dent the roof of the opposition's car. One of the most important early staging grounds for political activism on campus was the Dartmouth Christian Union, an organization founded in 1801 that was responsible for the initial picketing of Wallace's speech in 1963, but that strove to maintain civility within Webster Hall during his second speech by distributing flyers asking for silence.
So the photos from '63, all the people out picketing, including Richard Joseph, who was a member of the DCU. That's all organized by the DCU in advance, and they were very orderly and they kept it civil. And then for the second speech in '67, they actually were part of the crowd trying to maintain order and civility. Although the DCU was doubtless initially formed as a place for young men to give emphasis to their Christian faith, by the '60s it had become the place on campus where students went who cared about social justice in all its forms, whether it was the Vietnam War or civil rights issues, social justice issues at home. The organization's divergence from a traditional theological tack had been initiated by George Kalbfleisch, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, a former Navy chaplain during World War II, who had been appointed the graduate secretary of the DCU in 1948. And by the early 1960s, Kalbfleisch had become the director of undergraduate religious life and still very involved with the vision and mission of the DCU. And more than one undergraduate from that time has credited Kalbfleisch with kindling their commitment to socio-political activism. And those flames were stoked primarily through the DCU, whose office in College Hall at the time prominently displayed a large photograph of lynched African Americans, doubtless as a means of jolting Dartmouth students out of their complacency. In an article published in the May 1956 edition of the Dartmouth Alumni Magazine, nearly 10 years before, or around 10 years before all this started, Kalbfleisch stated that the meaning of, quote, the meaning of the DCU is to be found in its purpose and intention. As standing within our particular history and culture, the Christian Union wants especially to enter into fellowship with students who acknowledge no church or other religious affiliation for themselves, but who seek to know what is ultimately true and good, and who are persuaded to effect indeed what they may believe about God and man and the world. And in the same article, he describes the foundation of a political action commission that was formed within the DCU and was meeting with other colleges, including Wellesley and Smith, to, quote, work out a biblical ground for Christian and social political action. Okay, so I have just a few things here from the DCU. We have like lots of scrapbooks. What's really great is we have like four or five massive scrapbooks where it's basically a clipping book, where they clipped everything they could find related to the issues that they were passionate about. So here we have. This is the worst he's seen in 22 years. Hanover, New Hampshire. Woo. But it's not just about the civil rights movement. There are also some great clippings in here from like the Vietnam War protests and materials like that. So these books are a treasure trove. I also have a few photographs of Reverend Kalbfleisch. Love him on campus with classic Dartmouth photo, the tower in the background. But there's also one here of him meeting with students, and then also his obituary from 1966. So the DCU's message of faith resulting in action was not lost on Dartmouth students at the time. And in fact, right about the same time that Malcolm X was visiting campus, Jonas Liutkus, class of 65, and Roger Daly, 67, were sitting in the local jail down in Selma. The two students had been arrested while assisting with a voter registration drive in a small southern town. And they were jailed along with 22 other student workers associated with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, commonly referred to as SNCC. So SNCC was one of the most important organizations of the civil rights movement in the 60s, primarily because of its field work related to voter registration. And SNCC's chairman, Stokely Carmichael, actually came to Dartmouth a year after these arrests and spoke to a crowd of 1,400 students. And his visit was sponsored by the DCU and also by the Undergraduate Council. Returning to 1965 in Selma, SNCC's members had been arrested on charges of unlawful assembly because they were challenging the arbitrary 100-person limit previously placed upon the voter registration line outside the county courthouse. So the authorities said, oh, well, you can only have so many people stand in line to register, which is completely arbitrary, and then they just arrest everyone else who was. So they're like, okay, we'll go stand in line, we'll get arrested. Daly in particular was no stranger to the process, having already been arrested 3 times and jailed twice before on similar grounds. So there were some Dartmouth students walking the walk after being up here and being exposed to these issues, primarily through the DCU and Reverend Kalbfleisch. It's unclear what Liutkus' experience had been with the law before this incarceration. However, soon after, he wrote a letter to George Kalbfleisch, and in the letter, Liutkus said that, quote, jail has made me feel more at one with the movement. We have paid our dues to the movement, end quote. Several months later, in another letter to Kalbfleisch, Liutkus emphasized the need for more workers and concluded with sobering insight about the realities of resistance to the movement in the Deep South. He stated that he had to end his letter in order to drive some rural participants home, adding that, quote, an integrated car in the rural areas at night is messy business. So I pulled some things here. Unfortunately, Jonas Lucas died before his time. And so what I've done, though, is I put some of the things from his student file out here to look at, as well as we have actual carbons of all the letters that he sent to George Kopfleisch here. And they're fascinating to read. He talks about Martin Luther King's strategies, as well as his own experiences. We have a picture of him and Daley getting arrested. This is from the D, but this picture made the rounds. This is Daley, and it's Lucas is in the center there. So this made national headlines. This photo of these Dartmouth students getting thrown in jail in Selma. I also put his dean's card out there, which sort of has all his personal information, but then also any sort of official interactions that he has with the dean. And it's great because on one of them it says he's asked for a leave of absence so he can go work in Mississippi. And it says I guess he's still there, and then he comes back and he gets his degree and says this is a stand-up guy, a solid guy, I think is what he calls him. And he writes an open letter from Selma that's published in the Dartmouth. One of my favorite things from Lucas's file, this is sort of the standard, if any of you are Dartmouth alum, you've probably gotten something like this. This is sort of the standard request for information from alumni records, wanting to know what you've done, what you've been up to. And under career, it says present occupation. It says organizer. Nature of your business or profession. Social change. I love that. I think that's awesome. One newspaper claimed that Lucas and Daley were the first Northern college students to help SNCC and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in Selma. But they're hardly the last Dartmouth students to join the fight against segregation. Peter Buck, class of '68, is a prime example. In May of '65, the same year that they got arrested, he traveled south from Dartmouth to Williamston, North Carolina, and Atlanta, Georgia, to assist with voter registration efforts led by SCOPE, which is Summer Community Organization and Political Education. He recorded his experience with friends at Dartmouth and in the South in a diary in which he called himself a Northern agitator. And this is actually in his little Dartmouth notebook from '65. We've got that right here. He says he regretted friends whose, quote, general feeling seems to be recognition of a problem, but general disapproval of any liberal scheme for trying to solve it. Indeed, when first telling his friends of his plans to help with voter registration, Buck said that, quote, they threw a few pretty good battery of reasons why all the efforts being made aren't solving the problem and instead just hurting things. Is it doing the Negro any good to get him to register? End quote. And he responded by saying that, quote, I'm personally not content to wait a few hundred years to see that their rights as humans, and secondarily as Americans, be fulfilled. And followed up by reflecting on his friend's position, saying, I think they're kind of bogged down in a real apathy. Too bad the Southern students aren't a little more apathetic. Adults and KKK members too, for that matter. End quote. So we have his diary here. What's really interesting is he has these really long entries at first, and then it starts to get down to brass tacks, just like brief notes. He obviously doesn't have time to sit there and think too deeply, and it becomes filled with strategy and like action points. Like here's how to do this. You always go. You talk about these things at the door to get people to open up, to then be willing to register to vote. It's a really fascinating look inside the mind of an organizer for voting registration. Of course, obviously, white students weren't the only Dartmouth students working for social justice for African Americans at the time at Dartmouth. But the initial challenge faced by African American students at Dartmouth was that there were so few of them on campus. One notable alumnus in particular, Richard Joseph, who was responsible for bringing Malcolm X, and who was also in that photo I showed you guys. He reflected on his first day at Dartmouth saying, I went for a very long time before I saw another black student. And in fact, it's only then that it actually hit me that, oh my goodness, really, where am I? It even crossed my mind, am I the only black person on this campus? Joseph was, in fact, one of only about a dozen students on campus in the fall of 1961. And that following spring, he was present in Dartmouth Hall to hear Martin Luther King Jr. speak. And he says he remembered Reverend King scanning the sea of white faces until their eyes met. And for Joseph, it was one of several moments that triggered his political awakening while a student on campus. So he resolved to get involved, and he went on to work with the ABC program, which we've already talked about, as well as with George Kopfleisch and the DCU. He created something called the Negro Applications Encouragement Program, And it was intended to be a counterbalance to the old argument being put forth by the college administration that no African Americans were applying. And to back that up, there were only 5 African American students in his entire class. And the year before, there had been only 1. However, the next few years would see record numbers of black student enrollment. And by 1974, there were nearly 50 African American students in the graduating class. So what Joseph did is he got, George Cobfleisch partnered with him, gave him $100 to spend on connecting with all these recruitment officers across the country to encourage African American students to apply, just to apply, just get their applications in. It was a small gesture, but it was significant. What I've got here is some things that I think are really fascinating. I've got his oral history interview, which is just opened like as of like 4 days ago, which is kind of cool, and it's fascinating. I have this flyer, this pamphlet that was published called The Black Student at Dartmouth. And it's really interesting. I don't know the year exactly, but it's published by the, where'd it go? It's like a derivation of the Black Student Application Encouragement Committee. Okay, so I can't help but think that that's sort of an outgrowth of Joseph's initial creation of this program. But it's filled with some great insights about Dartmouth. It says, why Dartmouth? Although Hanover is a very white community, the more than 210 brothers on campus find much of value in the college in a small setting. So it starts talking about like how students are selected, talks about the AfroAmerican Society. Basically just the entire promotional pamphlet trying to make Dartmouth students, black students at Dartmouth visible, and also encourage applications. And they were up against a lot still at that point. This is fascinating. I just found this in the treasurer's records, and I'm still like boggling at it. It says at the top, it says Negroes in college, and it goes back as far as 1828, and it lists the names of all the African Americans who attended Dartmouth, and in some cases the degrees that they got. And you go all the way, it goes all the way up into 65. And there's Richard Joseph's name. Which is fascinating.
Who put that together?
Administration. It's from the treasurer's report, the treasurer's records. So that doesn't mean much in itself. Like it's one of the administrative branches. We're keeping track of that kind of thing. You can see the class of 64, just 1. Class of 63, 3. Class of 62, 5. And this is out of hundreds of students. So you can imagine how. I mean, I can't imagine what that must have been like. I have also a letter here from 64. I've had to redact this because some of these people are probably still alive. So I had to go in and like mark names out. It looks like a CIA document or something. But this sort of gives you an idea. I'm going to read a little bit of this. I have enough time. Okay, no, I can't read this. This is just brutally. This is pretty much like an internal memo saying, okay, here's how. If we have Negro students who want to come here, here's how we're going to handle the dorm situation. Here's how we're going to handle the rooming situation. If they ask for a single room, we're just going to give it to them. And if they want a room with somebody, if they mention that person mentions them, then we're definitely going to put those two people together. If they don't list a preference, but they want like a double or a triple, which is like you share like a common room. Then we're only going to put them with people. They basically say, don't put them with anybody Southern. Preferably look for people who are on scholarship or who are athletes, because they'll be familiar with African Americans and with poverty. Basically, that's what they're saying. And then I would recommend you read this. He says they matched somebody because they thought it would work. And he says, we guessed wrong. And they got to campus, and the African American student had already moved in. And the white student and his dad saw from the pictures that this guy was black, and so they went immediately and they were like, no, you can't do this. We don't want you to do this. And this is in 64. So I found that, I just found that actually today. It just blew my mind. Another thing here I have is I have the yearbook from 1960. There was one African American student in the entire class, several hundred. So, you know, you can. And you don't have to see this close up, right? They're all the same. Maybe not. And then there's one guy in there to display. And by contrast, if you look at 74, it's still predominantly white, obviously, but you're beginning to see more and more African Americans. I just sort of picked a random page, but by this point, I think that there was like 50 African Americans in the class of 74. All right, we're almost out of time. I'm going to talk really, and we can stay a little bit late if you guys can and you want to look at stuff. I'm totally okay with that because I'm being so mouthy.
Morgan, is this stuff out? Are you putting it all away after tonight, or are you keeping it in?
I will not put it away because I'm going to do a second session. So if you want to come back and look at any of this by yourself, you're totally welcome to do that. Just tell me, or come in and say you'd like to look at this stuff on hold. The last grouping of material that I have, and I'll speed through this. The AfroAmerican Society was founded by a group of African American students who got together in the fall of 1965 because they felt that one of the problems with being an African American student at Dartmouth was that the Dartmouth experience was exclusionary. Like there was nothing in the Dartmouth experience that connected with or was relevant for African American students. And one of the problems that they saw with that was that one of the problems was that African Americans were basically being asked to give up their identity as African Americans, and they were being assimilated into white culture. And as a result, all of the leaders of the African American community were being co-opted by the white community. And so instead of that, what they decided to do was to say, okay, we need to get more involved. We need to push the administration to include more in its programmatic efforts, to include things that engage the African American community here at Dartmouth. So what they did is they started participating in the ABC project. They initiated a bridge program to help incoming black students prepare for college by giving them some sort of a ramping up in the summer before they started. They also started sponsoring the annual festival of the Black Arts Festival. They have a whole series focused on black culture on campus, all kinds of events. They also started publishing a literary magazine, a literary journal called Blackout. And we actually have several issues of that here, which are pretty amazing. Okay, I'm going to shut up. This is obviously just a sampling. And this is not all the groups that are associated. There are things that I did not talk about, like the Association of Black Alumni. I did not talk about them at all at Dartmouth. But they're a very important group. There are other groups as well. There are other events that occur as well that are important, but this kind of at least gives you an idea. And with that, I will be quiet, except to say you can come back and look at this anytime you'd like. You don't have to make an appointment. You can just walk in and say, I was here for the civil rights talk, and I saw X, and I would really like to see it again. All right, thank you guys for coming.
Thank you.
Another pattern round two.
Yeah, thank you. There you go. Feel free to look at any of this stuff, though. Just be gentle with it, but you can pick it up and look at it. Turn pages, whatever you like.